What's going on, everyone? So the Phoenix Suns have a lot to figure out, right? Obviously, they have Kevin Durant and they have Devin Booker, but those two alone aren't enough for Phoenix to be a legit NBA champion, right? They basically got ran through by the Denver Nuggets. It took Devin Booker having basically a historic run for them to even be competitive and win a couple games. They just lacked depth, lack defense, lack general talent outside of like the top heaviness. And I absolutely think the Phoenix Suns are going to trade DeAndre Ayton. I will be shocked if DeAndre Ayton starts for the Phoenix Suns next year. I think that ship has sailed with them, and I think he's their best asset to go get some valuable pieces to bring to Phoenix to kind of start rounding out this roster. Plus, in Phoenix with Kevin Durant and Devin Booker, you don't need a 2010 a game type center. You just need somebody that can rebound, block shots, and just be a big body in the paint. That's basically it. So they can get many people to suffice and fill that role. The big question is Chris Paul, right? Now, there are several factors in which they could go about with Chris Paul. One is they look to try to move him, right? He has a partial guaranteed contract this year, and then he has a non-guaranteed contract next year. So there are absolutely teams that have players that are on multi-year deals that they may be willing to take on Chris Paul's money and try to unload it that way, right? Like think of a team like the Charlotte Hornets, right? They have the 2 pick. They also have guys like Terry Rozier, Gordon Hayward. They have several guys that are on multi-year deals that they would probably like to move off of. Again, just using them as an example, but that's something that they could look at and go, hey, Chris Paul, he's making, $35 million a year, $30 million a year, non-guaranteed. That could get off of like multiple contracts for us, and we could take Chris Paul, buy him out in his non-guaranteed deal, and then Chris Paul could be a free agent. The other alternative would be Phoenix themselves buying him out, and again, partial guaranteed deal, them buying out Chris Paul and then using whatever money that they would have left over in cap space to go sign a couple free agents, right? Because Phoenix just needs to fill out a roster. Phoenix was actually better without Chris Paul than they were with Chris Paul because, again, the ball is best suited in Kevin Durant and Devin Booker's hands. Chris Paul also, for whatever reason, decided, hey, I have Kevin Durant and Devin Booker on my team, but me and DeAndre Ayton are going to be the ones that are going to shoot all the shots down the stretch. It was just silly. But the point is, and the reason I'm talking about this on a Laker channel, is if Chris Paul, one way or another, again, I will be surprised if Chris Paul is on the Phoenix Suns. The new owner really wants to shake things up, really wants to build a contender, and I don't think he's going to be able to do that with Chris Paul. So I could see the Phoenix Suns basically pushing their chips to the table, using Chris Paul, using DeAndre Ayton to go and round out this roster around Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. And thus, Kevin Durant and Devin Booker would say goodbye to Chris Paul, and Chris Paul will be a free agent. Because any team that trades for him is going to buy him out. They're not going to keep him for the year, most likely. Or Phoenix just buys him out so they can use whatever money that they can to go get some new pieces. And that's where the Lakers could come in. Now, the Los Angeles Lakers would not trade for Chris Paul. It makes zero sense to go and trade for him, right? You're not trading like Malik Beasley and Mo Bamba for Chris Paul, especially with Chris Paul's injury history, especially with just his age and issues. But Chris Paul as a free agent who just got bought out makes a lot of sense for the Lakers. I mean, a world of sense for the Lakers, right? Like, imagine if you could replace Dennis Schroeder with Chris Paul. That's pretty good, right? Chris Paul, with all his flaws, is still a very good player. He just can't stay healthy. But if Chris Paul is basically your sixth man off the bench, if he goes down, it's not the end of the world. Right? Like if he misses and he ends up getting hurt in the playoffs, it's not the end of the world. If he can stay healthy, that's great. Chris Paul on a vet minimum might be the best vet minimum deal in the entire league. Like literally. So if Chris Paul became a free agent and the Lakers had an opportunity to sign him, I think the Lakers would jump on that in a heartbeat. One, him and LeBron are best friends, so I could see Chris Paul wanting to go to the Lakers. Two, Chris Paul loved LA. Three, Chris Paul is was supposed to be a Laker at one point. So you kind of right the ship there. I just think if at any point there is an opportunity for the Lakers to bring in Chris Paul off of a buyout, again, off of a buyout, I think you do that. No questions asked. Where else is he going to go? Right? Like, because look, if Chris Paul gets bought out, he's going to want a couple things. He's going to want, one, an actual rotation level. Maybe he doesn't necessarily have to start. He's going to want to start. But that doesn't necessarily mean he has to start. But he's going to want, he's going to want a real rotation spot. And he's going to want a contender and a contending team. The Lakers were just in the Western Conference Finals. They are a legit contending team. You add Chris Paul, the Lakers are a better team, right? Especially on a vet minimum deal. Again, I wouldn't trade for him for $30 million. That just makes zero sense. But if you can get Chris Paul for basically, $2 million, that might be the best contract in the entire league at that point. Because Chris Paul, if he stays healthy, you have one of the best basketball minds, a guy who could still get you buckets, who could still play make, right? LeBron showed the willingness to play off the ball more. He wants to continue to play in that role as the secondary playmaker, sort of second, third option. The big issue that the Lakers have had is getting AD the ball. Chris Paul is a guy that would be able to do that. Chris Paul is a guy that would be able to put AD in position to get the ball wherever he wants it and wherever he needs it. If the Lakers could find a way to get Chris Paul, you do that, no questions asked. I mean, Chris Paul, Anthony Davis, and LeBron James would be great in and of itself, but you'd still be able to basically keep your entire roster, right? And at that point, now you could definitely take D'Lo and go get some other pieces, right? Like, at that point, could you maybe go and get like a DeMar DeRozan, or, maybe you go trade for Buddy Hield and Miles Turner, something like that. And you have let's say Chris Paul, Austin Reeves, you have Rui Hachimura, or LeBron James, let's say at that point, LeBron James, Anthony Davis, and Miles Turner. I mean, that's the best team in the league. And you'd still have Jared Vanderbilt, Rui Hachimura off the bench, go sign a backup center, go get a legit center for backup. So you could play AD at the 5-2 in spots, but it's still another backup center. I mean, the Lakers would be ridiculous at that point. And it sounds like a made up scenario. It's not. It's really not. Because the Phoenix Suns can't afford to keep Chris Paul. I mean, there's already talk. As soon as the season was over for the Phoenix Suns, there were talks about Phoenix looking and exploring potential Chris Paul trades, or maybe even a potential buyout. Because they're not going to be able to build out the roster and keep Chris Paul. Any team that's going to trade for Chris Paul isn't trading for Chris Paul, they're trading for his salary, which means Chris Paul would end up getting bought out, which means that he could go wherever he wants. And guess what? His best friend is on the Lakers. He gets to go back to LA. He's getting paid because the Suns or whoever ends up buying him out is going to have to pay him that money, right? So he's going to get $15 million, and then he could just go sign a deal with the Lakers, for maybe 2 years, whatever, $5 million, get his difference, and go and contend for a championship. I mean, Chris Paul in the Lakers would just be perfect, right? As that backup point guard role. The Lakers need another playmaker, another scorer. Chris Paul fills that bill, right? Now, the concern is that his injury history and just his ability to not stay healthy throughout the playoffs and him shrinking in big moments. But again, if he's on a vet minimum contract and he's your fifth, sixth guy, essentially, who cares, right? Look, best case scenario, Chris Paul stays healthy and you probably win an NBA championship. Worst case scenario, Chris Paul doesn't stay healthy, and depending on the rest of your roster, you probably still win an NBA championship. Because again, he'd be a vet minimum deal. I think if you have the potential and you have the possibility of going and getting Chris Paul, I think you absolutely go get Chris Paul. Chris Paul on the Lakers is a no-brainer, in my opinion, for Chris Paul off of a buyout. No-brainer for the Lakers. LeBron James gets a guy that he undoubtedly trusts, because that's the big thing, right? Like, LeBron didn't really trust D'Lo at times. So, and he didn't trust Russ and all that. So, the problem is you have to get, like, LeBron has shown the willingness to play off the ball more and kind of play as another guy in the scheme. But he needs a guy that he can trust. He needs a guy that he knows, like, okay, I don't have to worry about them turning the ball over. I don't have to worry about them making a bad play. That's Chris Paul. LeBron James probably trusts nobody more than Chris Paul in this league. And just the biggest question with Chris Paul is just his injuries, right? Can he stay healthy? If Chris Paul can stay healthy, you're probably winning an NBA championship. Like, imagine, like, if you had Chris Paul in this series against Denver over Dennis Schroeder, you might have won that game, or you might have won the series. Right now, Chris Paul isn't going to help you on the defensive end, without a doubt. But those games were extremely close. And the Lakers just needed another guy that could put the ball in the hoop. Chris Paul, by himself, probably would have generated at least another 20-plus points per game. Just through playmaking and assists. He probably would have been able to get Anthony Davis going a little bit better. And he would have hit some shots and hit some big shots. Right? So let's say he gave you 10 and 5, right? 10 points, 5 assists. That's more than what Dennis Schroeder gave you a game. And that's basically the margin of error that the Lakers had that lost them the series. Lakers might have won this series if they had Chris Paul over Dennis Schroeder. Or even over D'Lo, right? I mean, D'Lo gave you nothing. So, I mean, all Chris Paul has to give you is something, and you're in a better position. Right? Now, again, Chris Paul probably would have been hurt, but my point is that if you have the right roster and you have the right talent around this team, Chris Paul on a vet minimum off of a buyout is such a low risk, insanely high reward type move. There might not be a better one in the league. Again, Chris Paul on a vet minimum deal, $30 million a year guy. I just, at this point, where else would he go? Right? Because no team is going to max him out, right? No, like, maybe a team would give him $10 million a year. You know, maybe they'd give him the taxpayer or something like that. The Lakers could give him the taxpayer, right? Maybe a team gives him like $10 million a year. Like, okay, the only teams that are going to have that kind of money are teams that are essentially middle of the pack teams or tanking teams. When he could go to the Lakers, play with LeBron James, be in LA, and also contend for an NBA championship. I'm pretty confident if Chris Paul ends up getting bought out, he ends up being a Laker. This is something, remember this. If you see Chris Paul end up getting bought out, remember, Laker Damas said he's going to the Lakers. And I think that this will very likely be one of the predictions that I get right. Again, assuming the Phoenix Suns trade him or buy him out themselves, maybe they're able to work out the roster otherwise. I don't really see how they do that. So if Chris Paul gets bought out, I think he goes to the Lakers. But anyway, as always, this is a discussion, so I pass the question on you. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. What do you think? Would you, get Chris Paul on a buyout, get him for a vet minimum deal, maybe even a taxpayer deal? Do that all day, including Sunday. Do you think, no, leave him alone, go find somebody younger, whatever? Again, Chris Paul, I know he's old, I know he's injury prone, but if you get him on a vet minimum deal, come on, that's almost fairy tale. But it's something that is definitely a reality. But again, love to hear it. Let me know.